Hello, I'm State Senator Lisa Baker from Luzerne County. Pennsylvania has a rich history of dynamic leaders and decisive events. It is important for us to learn and understand the valuable lessons of our past. In our area, we proudly celebrate and commemorate notable individuals and events. But these interesting and instructive stories are little known outside of our local community. The truth is, our destiny as a Commonwealth was often hard-won. People displayed exceptional courage and determination in responding to dire and devastating circumstances. This too is inspiring. Given my strong commitment to history, I am pleased to commend this edition of Rediscovering Pennsylvania's Historymakers, featuring pivotal events that occurred in northeastern Pennsylvania during the 1700s.
Hello, I'm Dave Sollenberger. Welcome to the Wyoming Valley, along the banks of the Susquehanna River in Luzerne County. Ask someone to name an infamous American military disaster, and they would probably say Custer's Last Stand, where in 1876 George Armstrong Custer and 265 troops were wiped out at the Little Bighorn River by a huge Indian force led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. What you might not know is that nearly a century earlier, a larger massacre took place right here in Pennsylvania, a pivotal event in the American Revolution. On this edition of Rediscovering Pennsylvania's Historymakers, we share the story of the Battle of Wyoming, often called the Wyoming Massacre.
The Battle of Wyoming historically was a very important event. Just like the way we now talk about Remember 9/11 or Remember Pearl Harbor, people in the 1800s talked about Remember Wyoming. It was a very significant moment, a truly tragic moment in American history during the American Revolution.
It's not surprising that people would fight over this land. Even back in the 1700s, the Wyoming Valley offered more than just gorgeous scenery. The Susquehanna River was a major transportation route. The area was productive agriculturally. It was a traditional hunting ground for Native Americans.
This was just a great area. The river provided just abundant and very fertile soil. It was a great place to grow crops. And the beauty of the area, it was unparalleled. You had a Scottish poet who had never even been here write this long, famous poem about Wyoming, and it just was a beautiful area.
The fighting arose from a complication far different than the usual conflict between Native Americans and encroaching settlers. Connecticut and Pennsylvania both laid claim to the Wyoming Valley. It seems that Connecticut's 1662 charter and Pennsylvania's 1681 charter from King George II of England overlapped substantially. Apparently the king didn't know all that much about geography and was clearly not an expert in North American real estate. So settlers from both states claimed the land as their own. The dispute led to several rounds of bloodshed in what is known as the Yankee-Pennamite Wars.
The Connecticut settlers were called Yankees, and of course the people who were in favor of Pennsylvania were called the Pennamites. The first settlement here in the Wyoming Valley was in 1762, when a group of Connecticut settlers came down under the auspices of the Susquehanna Company, who had purchased most of northeastern Pennsylvania from the Iroquois in 1753, and they established a settlement along Mill Creek in Wilkes-Barre. They planted crops and went back to Connecticut for the winter. They came back in the spring of 1763, and more came down and established a settlement. In October of that year, there was an Indian raid, and what I refer to as the first Wyoming Massacre. A number of the settlers were killed, and the survivors went back to Connecticut. Because the French and Indian War was going on, there was no further attempt to settle in the valley until 1769, when a group of 40 settlers from Connecticut came down and established what was known as the 40 Fort. Penn sent a force up here to drive out the Connecticut, and between 1770 and 1772, it was a seesaw back and forth between Connecticut being in possession, Pennamites being in possession. By the time the Revolution broke out in 1775, the Connecticut settlers were in possession of the Wyoming Valley, and it was they who were here at the time of the battle.
During the American Revolution, Wyoming Valley grain helped to feed Washington's army, and the Susquehanna River was a transportation route. It was inevitable that the settlements would be targets for attack. While a series of forts had been constructed for defense, they were less formidable than the forts depicted in movies. Even more, the best fighters were off east with the American army.
The defense force locally was the militia, was the 24th Connecticut Militia, and it basically were the inhabitants of the valley, farmers, blacksmiths, shopkeepers, boys, men, not the military age that were off with the second and first independent companies.
The force attacking the valley included British loyalists known as Tories, displaced Pennsylvania settlers who wanted to take back their land, and Native Americans, mostly from the Seneca tribe of the Iroquois Confederation. On July 1, 1778, British Major John Butler's force of about 400 British Allied Rangers and 600 Indians invaded the Wyoming Valley and seized the Yankee forts at Wintermood and Jenkins on the western banks of the Susquehanna River just above Wilkes-Barre. Zebulon Butler, a leader in the Connecticut settlement of the valley and in the Yankee-Pennamite conflict, was now a lieutenant colonel in the Continental Army. Home on leave, he took command of the small Patriot force. Nathan Dennison, a colonel in the Connecticut militia, served as second in command. The local settlers, probably 400 to 500 fighters, had a critical decision to make. Should they stay in the safety of local forts and await reinforcements that had been sent? Or should they move out and attack an enemy of unknown numbers and uncertain disposition of their fighters? Prodding the attack decision were the Paxton Boys, who years earlier had massacred Conestoga Indians in Lancaster and were highly contemptuous of Indians. After heated arguments, Butler, Dennison, and the other leaders gave in to those who insisted on attacking. This impulsive decision would lead to disaster.
They were not able to ascertain the exact size of the invading force because they couldn't get scouts close enough to the British encampment. There were several groups within the militia, primarily those led by Lazarus Stewart, who advocated going out and driving the Indians out of and the British out of the valley because they were burning and looting the farms in the northern part of what's now Exeter, Wyoming, West Pittston area. They finally prevailed by challenging the courage of Colonel Dennison and Colonel Butler, and the militia marched out of the fort at approximately noon on the 3rd of July. They went first to Abrams Creek, where they established a line of defense on the creek bank, hoping that the British would attack across the creek. After about an hour and a half, 2 hours, when that didn't happen, again, the hotheads, if you will, under Lazarus Stewart, wanted to go forward because British Butler had set the Wintermute House on fire to lure the militia, thinking that the British were retreating from the valley. So they argued that they should go and drive them out of the valley. Eventually that's what happened. They formed a column and they started to march up what was known as the Great Road until they ran into British skirmishers in what's now the borough of Wyoming. At that point they formed a line of battle and continued to advance over what was known as Abraham Plain until they reached what became the battlefield at Wintermute's farm.
They were outnumbered and had moved into a trap. After the militia fired a couple of ineffective volleys, the Indians came pouring out of the woods, and the rout was on. The battle lasted only about 45 minutes. Casualties were light on the British side, but for the Americans, the ghastly result came to be called a massacre. Colonel Dennison reported 268 killed. 227 scalps were taken. Only 60 of those who rushed out to battle escaped death or capture. Of those taken captive, only 5 survived. In addition, dozens of settlers who fled the area died in the swamps. All told, as many as 340 Americans perished. But what inflamed public reaction even more was something that happened on this spot, a spot that would later become known as Queen Esther's Rock.
After the battle, those who had escaped got either to Fort Wilkes-Barre or to the 40 Fort. Those who were captured were held prisoner by the British. Queen Esther Montour was half French, half Indian. It's alleged, it's never been proven disproved or proven that she was in fact here. But two of the captives escaped while they were being held to wait for their turn to be knelt at this rock when this Indian woman with a maul went around bashing their skulls on the rock. And two of them managed, it was either be killed trying to escape or end up on the rock, and they did manage to escape and get back to Forty Fort. So there is eyewitness accounts. Captain Blanchard, who was in command of the Pittston Company at Pittston Fort on the east side of the river, that night he and some of the men ventured out of the fort and came down along the riverbank and could see across the river to the battlefield area where the Indians were killing and torturing the prisoners that they had captured during the battle from the militia. After the battle, when the British finally withdrew around July the 8th, they went up to the area and they did find bodies in a circle around the rock with their heads smashed in. So there is proof, eyewitness accounts. Whether it was Queen Esther or not is another story.
One of the most poignant stories of the conflict occurred when two brothers, each on a different side of the conflict, met face to face.
In the militia was a gentleman named Henry Pencil, and he managed to escape from the battlefield to Monocanoc Island in the Susquehanna River, where he was hiding behind a log. His brother, John Pencil, was with the Rangers. He was a Tory, and he was on the island and stumbled across his brother. Henry begged for his life and asked John to spare his life, and John loaded his gun and said he would rather shoot him than look at him because he was a rebel, and shot his brother, and it's known as the fratricide of Wyoming. And that was witnessed by another militiaman who was hiding on the island.
The disaster called for some quick and hard decisions by those still in the forts and settlements, including many women and children.
The impact on the women and children would have been terrifying. It would have been devastating, because think of your husband being called into battle and you have to stay behind. Not only your husband, but maybe your father, your brother, your own sons, regardless of age, maybe up until the age of 13 and 14 were then sent into battle. And you had to stay back, maybe with just a few children with you, and maybe older men, the elderly, with no one to protect you. So after the battle, and you can hear that happening in the distance, you're wondering, are they alive? Are they going to come back? And if they do come back, what condition will they be in? Now, for the Battle of Wyoming, many of them didn't come back. Not only many of them didn't come back, but some of them were taken prisoner and later tortured that evening. So you have that devastating news of, as they're coming back, as the men are coming back from battle, little by little, you're waiting and you're looking to see if it's your husband that's coming, your son, and realizing that they're not coming back. So now what do? And with the Battle of Wyoming, what ended up happening is they came into the community and they burned what you had. They took what you had, they pillaged what you had. So not only did you lose your spouse or your children, the women were left with very few possessions, if any. And what happened with the Battle of Wyoming as well was they had to escape. They had to escape the Wyoming Valley because the fort was lost. It was surrendered, and there was nowhere else to go. So many of these families, alone with maybe, if they were lucky enough to have men that came back, had to deal with the wounded and the sick and the injured and try to escape at the same time. So imagine having to maybe fashion a raft, as what happened with our family, and with logs and whatever was available and canoes, and get into these vessels and escape through the Susquehanna River to a better place and try to escape what was happening. So if you can imagine knowing that your family is on a battlefield dead, and then you have to in turn leave with nothing. And some of these women had were pregnant when they were in the Wyoming Valley. Some of them had infants, and unfortunately many of them died along the way as they escaped the Wyoming Valley. So this was a very devastating loss.
The day after the battle, Colonel Dennison surrendered the 3 remaining forts. The delay gave the Army soldiers time to escape so they would not become prisoners to be tortured and killed. The militia were given paroles to sit out the war.
The battle itself, more of a massacre, was really one of the hallmarks of the Revolution. That combined with the attack at Cherry Valley in New York were just absolute massacres. It was part of almost early terrorism in this country. They frankly irritated George Washington so badly that he sent one of his trusted generals, General John Sullivan, up through the Susquehanna River Valley really to decimate the Native American populations because they were so angry at what had happened in these 2 massacres. It was probably one of the most publicized massacres of the American Revolution. The Connecticut settlers here, a lot of whom returned to Connecticut, made people very aware of what had happened here and really the true tragedy of what had gone on between the Tories, the Native Americans, and the colonial settlers who were here. It was really one of the key battles of the American Revolution.
Americans moved quickly to avenge the bloody and humiliating defeat and to ensure the safety of the settlers who wanted to return to the Wyoming Valley. 3 months later, a regular Army regiment under the command of Thomas Hartley and several militia companies went up the Susquehanna River as far as Tioga, burning Indian villages. The following year, Washington dispatched one of his top generals, New Hampshire's John Sullivan, to lead a punitive expedition. While there were not many fights, the troops destroyed numerous Indian villages, crops, and orchards in New York, severely crippling the ability of the Indians to wantonly attack the Pennsylvania frontier.
It just was a beautiful area, so I think it attracted people easily to come back and reestablish themselves here in the community.
Some of those who fled to Connecticut would never return. Others would be moved to the new Westmoreland County in western Pennsylvania once the land dispute was finally resolved years after the Revolution ended. But the stalwarts who fought for the area and survived became community and political leaders. When Luzerne County was established in 1786, Zebulon Butler was picked as one of the 3 commissioners.
He also supervises the construction of highways and bridges for the county, and he gets other appointed assigned tasks to him, such as building the county courthouse, building the jail, and building and taking subscriptions for the first church. And these were all built on Public Square in Wilkes-Barre. When Butler first comes here with the Susquehanna Land Company, he built a log cabin in 1773, and then that cabin gets enlarged. And I happen to be the curator now of the Zebulon Butler House Museum. It is the oldest existing house in Wilkes-Barre, and we're in the process of turning it into a museum, not only to chronicle Butler's life, but 4 generations of the Butler family that have lived there from 1773 until the end of the Civil War in 1866. And probably the greatest testament to the Butler family in Luzerne County is just about every community, every borough, every city, every township has a Butler Street. And we also have a Butler Township for Luzerne County.
Several years later, Nathan Dennison built this house that contained the table on which the documents of surrender to the British were signed. It remains a local landmark to this day.
It's in the collection of the Luzerne County Historical Society, and it's here on view at the Dennison House. This is the table that in 1778, Nathan Dennison and John Butler signed the papers after the Battle of Wyoming. Sort of the surrender, capitulation, they were sort of synonymous terms at the time. Nathan Dennison is recognized for having it come to a pretty lenient end. The big part of the agreement was that the British wouldn't burn the fort. Because of Nathan's qualities as a leader, his skills, his experience in this area from very early on, and these other roles that he played, Justice of the Peace, Judge, he was also part of the Executive Council, and which is comparable to the Senate today, and that those skills helped him be a natural choice for that position.
Both of these leaders have memorial markers in local cemeteries. As horrific and indelible as the Wyoming massacre was, it has faded from the pages of most history books.
I think the story, unfortunately, has somehow gotten lost to many people because of just the length and the time of American history. But it is still one of the key moments. And, you know, history tends to repeat itself. This was the Tories, the British attempts to create some sort of a terroristic attack in communities to develop fear. And here we are over 200 years later, and we see that occurring again, although in a different form. But it's almost like history repeats itself. So it's unfortunate that these moments, these great moments in American history, somehow get sidetracked and ignored by future generations.
Fortunately, the story has not gotten sidetracked for people who live here in the Wyoming Valley. Within decades of the battle, plans were forming for a monument to those who gave their lives on land donated by Fisher Gay. Today, an imposing monument marks a mass grave where victims of the massacre are buried. It was dedicated in 1878 on the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Wyoming.
The keynote speaker on the 4th of July was none other than President Rutherford B. Hayes, who had become the president in a kind of controversial election. He was a very popular American figure because of his Civil War past. They planned a 3 or 4 day event. They invited all sorts of dignitaries, including the President of the United States. And surprisingly, about a week before the event, a letter came from the White House that said the President will be there. And not only was he there, but he brought along the Attorney General of the United States, the Secretary of the Treasury, and he was the keynote speaker at that year's, the very first formal commemoration of the Battle of Wyoming for the 100th anniversary. But it just wasn't an event at the monument itself. It was an event that there were parades, there were races, there were all sorts of illuminations in Wilkes-Barre, some sort of early fireworks. It went on for days. They actually rebuilt 40 Fort, where the people had come from. They dug up the foundations and they built a temporary fort to kind of show what it was like to live in the community in 1778. That was really one of the great moments. 50,000 or more people showed up at the monument to see the president and to hear all the different speakers. Just an amazing event here in the Wyoming Valley.
Each summer, the Wyoming Commemorative Association holds a 4th of July service that draws a large crowd of residents and officials and a contingent of reenactors, many of whom are descendants of the early settlers. Numerous local organizations provide floral displays that adorn the monument. 24th Connecticut Militia reenactors fire tribute volleys.
Take care! Halt! Make ready! Take aim! Elevate! Fire! Run and load!
The event is a fine illustration of a community that remembers its roots, even the dark days that defined it.
It gives me chills to be on the ground where my ancestor actually was in this horrific battle, Battle of Wyoming, or some people call it the Wyoming Valley Massacre. They're going to march out against an overwhelming tide of Native Americans and Loyalists and British and give them battle and defend their homes and hearths. You know, and he was actually here marching right up this road and going into battle and running for his life to get out of here, and he actually survived, one of the survivors, thank God, or else I probably wouldn't be here.
Reenactors are committed to increasing knowledge of and interest in pivotal events such as the Battle of Wyoming.
By the kids seeing and being able to touch and look and see how life was lived back then, and it was not easy to live life, and how difficult it was, they get an idea of how different history is than what they're taught in books.
With historical tourism on the rise, local tourism advocates here have collaborated to create a driving tour connecting the sites in this period of Pennsylvania history, including the Wyoming Valley battle sites.
People drive by and they'll say, I never even knew it was there. We're doing the Facebook postings, and we do this little caption is, did you know? And so sometimes we'll just capture one of those markers and say, did you know this happened right here in your backyard? Did you know this happened right here in your county? Or, you know, we also promote the whole Northeast and the state of Pennsylvania. So we do these little facts. It's important to get that information out to everyone.
Driving tours, historical reenactments, commemorative events, displays of artifacts and historical materials are all effective ways of reviving the past and giving us a greater appreciation of the men and women who settled, fought over, and built the communities of the Wyoming Valley. Today, the battlefield site is covered by residential and commercial development. Stone markers remind us of the sites of the forts that figured in the Battle of Wyoming. And the spirit of the battle is brought to life in an exhibit at the Luzerne County Historical Society, titled The Battle of Wyoming at 240, Revolution on the Home Front. Letters to and from Zebulon Butler and Nathan Dennison discussing defense, reinforcements, and follow-up attacks are showcased, along with dramatic accounts from survivors. Depictions of the massacre, artifacts from the battlefield and settlements, and weapons used by soldiers and warriors are all on display. Seeing is to learn and become emotionally involved in the story. Not every event in Pennsylvania's past is marked by good judgment or uplifting outcome. This story shows what a complicated and perilous undertaking the American Revolution was along the frontier. The development of our Commonwealth was not just a matter of people moving wagons westward and carving farms and communities from the woods. Staking a claim and holding it against those who would dispute it was hazardous and frequently deadly work. In warfare, families and neighbors took opposing sides for reasons that ranged from patriotism to principle to personal interest. Bitter disputes such as those over control of the Wyoming Valley and tragic defeats such as the Wyoming Massacre defined our destiny as much as moments of glorious triumph did. We rediscover Pennsylvania's history makers, and we can better appreciate the sacrifices, the determination, and devotion involved in establishing the Pennsylvania we know today. I'm Dave Sollenberger. Thank you for joining us.